Everybody give it up again for Sarah Wang here from Andreessen Horowitz. Sarah and I had a stated goal going into this, which is we want to make this conversation completely identical to the conversation that we would just have sitting backstage, whether you were here or not, as we dig into just about everything in the realm of the partnerships universe, the market, and beyond. Sarah, as some of you may know, is on our board of directors here at Crossbeam. Also is a general partner at the growth fund of Andreessen Horowitz, a firm that kind of needs no introduction, has tremendous brand in the space, and is also a really prolific thought leader around always what's coming next in the universe of technology. So what I really want to do is kind of dig in and almost jump in based on some of the things that I said earlier, and as all great board members do, give you an opportunity to kind of call BS on anything that, that I might have said, right? Because I think there's obviously a lot of shifts going on in the market at large, but at the same time, these really exciting things in the partnerships universe that seem to kind of amount to maybe a shift of their own that kind of counterbalances that. And just want to generally understand, like, you know, how real is that? And how real do you think, you know, what we're seeing in real portfolio companies out there in the market is a lot of this growth through partnerships really becoming?
Yeah. Is something going on in the market? No, totally. Yeah, and I think a lot of what you said was spot on, but maybe I'll put some real points around it in terms of what I'm seeing in the market. And I'll bring a different perspective, which is that of fundraising. And I've been an investor for over a decade, seen different cycles, I think full caveat, don't have a crystal ball on what is going on. Clearly something is going on. I think what's very interesting in the fundraising market that has started to turn is that not only are valuations coming down, rounds have started to not get done. And that is not, I don't want to end with a doom and gloom message because it certainly isn't. I think what that means is that being more efficient has started to come back in vogue. I think for a very long time, all valuations were completely correlated with growth. And now if you run the math on the public markets, if you look at even private rounds, growth plus efficiency, your margin, your profitability, however you want to measure that, is the biggest driver of what your company is actually valued at. And what does that mean for companies? I think there's a round of belt tightening coming along. We just ran a survey actually of 90, almost 100 Andreessen Horowitz portfolio companies. Very few, less than a handful are planning any layoffs. I'd say 2 out of 100, but 30% are planning on cutting back. And they're planning on cutting back on anything that is nice to have, not need to have. Just to translate this further, what does this mean for the people in this room, your teams? I think it's a good thing. Honestly, partnerships are more important than ever, and specifically because you're bringing in pipeline, you're shortening sales cycles, and you're increasing conversion rates. And that's a very good thing, because that is need to have, not nice to have, especially in this environment. I would say in an environment where fundraising is virtually free, the market is flowing, it's almost more nice to have than need to have. The flip side is that if you're not doing that, I think there is some danger, right? This is sort of the kick in the butt for partnerships teams to say, like, hey, this is the actual impact that we're having. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir, though, because for the folks in this room, you're obviously here, you're on Crossbeam, you're a big believer in measuring hard ROI of partnerships, but I think that's sort of the reality that we're in today. And if I may, actually, one example that came up recently, I was looking at 2 companies. I won't name names, but one is in the e-commerce space. Are there any e-commerce companies? Nice, awesome. E-commerce is such a textbook case study on how you effectively partner. But this company, as round numbers, 100 million of ARR. Their plan is to go to 200. And I'm looking at another company where they're at 5 million of ARR. Their plan is to go to 15 million. One has 50% partner-generated pipeline, and the other has 100% sales-generated pipeline, the smaller one. And as an investment team, we're more willing to bet that the 100 goes to 200 because of how consistent their partner-generated pipeline has got. That team could literally go to sleep for a year and come back and they'd be at 200 million of ARR. We feel very confident about that. The sales-generated pipeline, we've discounted that internally from 5 to 10 million of ARR, right? So like cut it in half, essentially. And so that's just a real-life example of how investors and board members are thinking about it.
That's amazing. And some of what I talked about was this idea of an inflection point. And a lot of what you're saying about the importance of partnerships, would it have been true 5 years ago? Would it have been true 10 years ago? And if not, why not, right? And I actually think back to when you were doing due diligence on Crossbeam to begin with, and kind of going out and asking these questions of what's going on in this partnership technology space, like why now, really? And I wonder if you can share just a little bit of what you learned in doing that diligence, and like honestly, even the bad stuff, right? Like what are the things that would have been challenges or kind of given pause?
Yeah, absolutely. Bob and I love geeking out on partnerships, although I feel like this is the right audience to do so. No, absolutely. And honestly, 5 years ago, no. And even when my partner Jennifer and I, who's in the audience, were doing our diligence, we talked to some old school sales folks who told us partnerships is where non-revenue things go to die. And I said, you're doing partnerships wrong. Am I right? Yeah, exactly.
We'll take it. Yeah.
But I think that was the misconception for a very long time. And to be fair, there probably were some not well-run partnerships teams where the ROI was low back in the day. But I think what's changed is a couple things. One, there's just been this Cambrian explosion of SaaS applications, and it doesn't make sense for everyone to spin up a direct sales team and go heavy at this, expensive direct effort where the shift to best in class means that you're probably not going to get into a customer and upsell a monolithic suite the way you used to do if you were SAP or Oracle. That's just not how customers want to buy software these days. That's not how they optimize their own internal ROI. And so this ecosystem play that Bob mentioned in his opening remarks is a way of life. And I think the ecosystem of startups and established companies is just so much richer than it was before. Customers see that, and if you're not selling alongside the software that they also want to be using, you're at a real disadvantage. And I think this concept actually plays out in, you start to see stacks, right? The best-in-class e-commerce stack. I don't know if there are any data companies, anyone who touches the data ecosystem in the audience. But you hear about, I see, yes, nice.
In the back.
But you hear about the modern data stack. What does that look like? And honestly, we talk to stakeholders, it starts to converge. Everyone is saying, hey, my modern data stack has Snowflake, it has Fivetran, it has dbt, it has XYZ in it. And if you're not named in that, you actually start to fall behind. The smart ones, including some of the companies in that, the list that I just mentioned, are selling together. And that's a really big change in the environment.
Yeah, I may go slightly off book here because you just made me think of a really interesting nuance that we try to handle in our content, but is always a little challenging, which is this difference between technology partnerships and channel partnerships. And I think we've probably got a lot of folks in the crowd. It's probably skewed a little more toward the tech partnership side, but I know for a fact there's a bunch of channel folks here as well, which include agency partners, system integrators, resellers, and the like. And I think one trend that has been really interesting for us is kind of this convergence of these two categories, because at the end of the day, they both start to be all about the revenue storytelling. Whether you started on the product side and building a tech integration, or you started on the services side and bringing kind of the last mile of service delivery, what ends up happening really is this deal acceleration, this increase in ACV, et cetera. And I wonder if you've seen any of that kind of in the universe of these companies that you see that have that big partner-generated pipeline. When you talk about half of the pipeline is from partners, is that tech partners? Is it service partners? Is it a combination of the two? And do VCs in the boardroom think about those things differently, or are they kind of converging into one stack?
Yeah, that's a great point. I would say it's often a mix of the two, and the best partnership programs do take advantage of both I guess you traditionally call it tech partnerships or channel partnerships, with channel partnerships being, as you said, service agencies, et cetera. I would say the most powerful programs usually combine the two. And it's great that you bring that up. I mean, a quintessential, and by the way, some of you may partner with this company, so you can keep me honest, but one of the quintessential examples of a successful tech company channel partnership is UiPath, a company called UiPath, which works in the process automation space. And the factoid that people like to share is that for every dollar that UiPath would make, UiPath would generate its partner $4. So you can imagine that its partners were pretty darn motivated to sell UiPath to their customers. And Accenture has a lot of customers, right? And this mutually beneficial relationship very much exists in that world. And I think those who take advantage of it, like a UiPath, have really benefited from digging into this gigantic customer base that they bring. And then the second piece, I mentioned diversity. Having all of your eggs in one basket is never a good thing. I can tell you from an investor, when I look at a partner-generated pipeline, the first thing I ask is it all being generated by one partner? The reason I had so much conviction in that example that I mentioned to you of going from 100 to 200 was that this company had 50 partners that were all generating no more than 5% of revenue each. So it was I think a sign to me of predictability.
Yeah, that's incredible. So you talked a little bit about the old stigma of partnerships, that kind of journeyman salesperson who says, partnerships is a parking lot, or partnerships is kind of where, and we have content on this too, right? It's like there's an article about kind of this old stigma where, in the good old days of partnerships, if you had a co-founder and didn't quite know what to do with them and the business had outgrown them, you just make them head of partnerships, right? It's like there is a little bit of that like I think we all know, right? The history of that universe, and what I think has been so amazing is just the rise of the partnership professional, and how much credibility and importance has been placed on that discipline and the expertise that can be built up around a person that truly is a partnership leader in the purest sense of the word. And I know even in some of your due diligence on Crossbeam, you started to see the emergence of some of these new titles that are showing up around the partnership universe. And I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit, like the discipline of partnerships, the importance of that partnerships hire, and when this comes up in the boardroom, what are the things that, from an org chart perspective, are part of the conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot to unpack there. Maybe I'll start with the first question. One of the things that I've been very fascinated by is just a student of go-to-market, and actually a prior investor in a company called ZoomInfo. I don't know if you guys have heard of that sales and marketing intelligence tool. But one of the things that when we first invested in ZoomInfo back in 2014, when I was with another firm, that we really rode the wave of was the rise of the SDR, right? This is old news. It's decade plus long trend, big change at the time back in 2014, as you can imagine. People were like, "What are SDRs? They're useless, et cetera." But at the time, they were growing 3x the rate of field sales. And now, I haven't met a company without a team of SDRs. It's pretty commonplace. And I'm sure this group has heard this term. You probably even have some on your team. But what's been really interesting, again, as a student of go-to-market evolution, is the rise of the PDR, right? And I think, Bob, one of the things you talked about on this stage just earlier was that partnerships is about collaboration. It's not about this, hey, zero-sum game, but I'm gonna have to pull this lead out of you, and then I'll try to resist giving you anything, right? It's actually the more generous you are, the more you get, right? That is the ethos of partnerships that I think is very different than sales, and very additive to sales. And so one of the neat things that we've seen is that, hey, how do you actually implement and professionalize this? Having PDRs, or people who are really dedicated to helping partners and in turn having them help you, has really started to become a trend in our portfolio, outside of our portfolio. And that's one of the things that honestly got us really excited about Crossbeam and your place in the ecosystem.
Yeah.
More generally in the boardroom, partnerships is the number one hire that we hear our early companies make. And for the companies that have really nailed it, our best performing companies are relying very heavily on partnerships. I think I threw out there a company where 50% of their pipeline was being generated by partnerships. One of my best friends is a VP of enterprise sales. Kind of the old school, very much in the old school force management, enterprise sales school of thought is how she was raised. And she told me that she joined her current company because she heard that partnerships were a big part of generating pipeline. And who wants to fight the uphill sales-led battle of 100% pipeline generation? So it's the number one hire that we hear for our Series B and earlier companies. And I think when it works, it's very much tied to results. And that's sort of the new era of partnerships that we're seeing.
Yeah, and that's so fascinating that it feels like that is moving earlier and earlier. Like I think a lot of when you think about that same kind of classic partnerships model, rewind the clock 5 years, rewind 10 years, you might not see. In fact, when we started Crossbeam, we used to say, our target market is anybody that has the word partnerships in somebody's title somewhere, and usually that's companies with 200 plus employees or 300 plus employees. Right. We're starting to see partnership hires get made employee 5, employee 10.
Absolutely.
And I wonder if you can unpack that a little bit and what do you think is happening? What do you think is different? Maybe it's some of the things you've already touched on, but this seems like maybe part of that storytelling of that kind of Cambrian explosion of SaaS apps and just the relevance of this earlier on in the product market fit journey for these companies.
Yeah, absolutely. And it definitely touches on some of the things that we mentioned. I think two other things that I haven't mentioned yet, but we now have this new wave of companies that were startups but are now very successful. So like a Snowflake or a Shopify. And for them, their next layer of growth is actually monetizing their existing customer base. They're all creating marketplaces. You probably have seen them or part of them. That's not an accident or experiment. They're looking for their next avenue of growth. And for them, there's sort of this bigger willingness to partner with newer companies that come back and help their bottom line, obviously, but also enrich in that ecosystem that they're creating. I think that's one, because there have been very nice companies, large companies even, built off the backs of Shopify, Snowflake, you name it, Atlassian, et cetera. And so that's one thing that I think is changing. And then the second piece does come back to this point that I made about selling in a stack and being one of the default names that people go to, because every buyer gets kind of lazy, right? You don't want to do a full RFP of everything, right? You kind of just want to ask your friends, hey, what are you using? And if you start to hear 8 out of your 10 friends say the exact same names in their stack and you have respect for them, they're the leaders in their space, you're like, hey, can't go wrong buying the new IBM, which is a stack of like the top 10 best, top 10 best software tools in whatever space you're in. Mm-hmm. So I think those two combined have led to this migration much earlier. And to your point, I do see partnerships being the 5th hire, the 10th hire, the 20th hire. And from an investor and boardroom perspective, we're highly encouraging of that, because if you can get your name in the door early, get the right integrations in place, right? It's not just a sales and marketing story, it's also a product story. Get the right partners to be focused on you. You're actually accelerating way past your competitors much earlier on and sort of creating the self-fulfilling prophecy around yourself.
Yeah, that's incredible. I often quote this interview that Mark Andreessen was in, where there's kind of this glib quote that is, there's only 2 ways to make money in software: bundling and unbundling. And you talk about things like the modern data stack, and it's a perfect example of this massive unbundling cycle where what used to be this one product has now been kind of deconstructed into an entire ecosystem of these interconnected best-in-class tools. And I guess I'm kind of curious if you have any thoughts on, it's almost like we're in the midst of the great unbundling with the emergence of the API economy and the maturity of it. It seems like almost every stack has been exploded out into these many, many, many best-in-class kind of slices of the pie. Are we ever at risk of rebundling, I guess? And do you ever see that out in the markets? And when you think about this awesome connective tissue that we're all responsible for building at this conference, are there reasons to believe that's got staying power and that that's actually kind of the new way? Or are we part of just kind of a really interesting piece of a sine wave that is history repeating itself?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I
try to spring things we didn't plan for on stage. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll fully admit, I mean, who knows? But I think there are a couple indicators that we are in something that has staying power. And what's exciting, I'll actually keep going back to the e-commerce example because there's a bunch of folks in here that are from that ecosystem. But it's one that, I think e-commerce enablement is the greatest secular trend of the next decade, probably the next couple of decades. Our e-commerce penetration is incredibly low. So I'll preface it by saying it's a space that I'm very, very excited about. Talk to buyers in it all the time. And I actually talked to one buyer recently. I was like, hey, what's your stack? And he named 20 things, literally 20 items. On the one hand, I was like, hey, that's a lot of things. Like, do you want to consolidate? And he told me, he was like, well, I was doing everything on Salesforce before. Sorry, I hope there are no Salesforce people here.
We've got at least a few.
Okay, got it. That's why Salesforce is investing in the ecosystem. But he said, we were all on Salesforce Commerce Cloud before this. And, it just, in this market, we need customization, we need flexibility. And without that, we're actually losing revenue and falling behind our competitors. I think the next gen and the new wave of tooling out there is the only way he was able to get that for his company. And I think in this API economy where integrations are more seamless than ever, there's no more trade-off for companies to say like, hey, actually, we should just go for this monolithic solution, sacrifice quality because, hey, at least all of my systems talk to each other, right? Like, we're just seeing less of that because the trade-off is not there anymore. And for him, he was actually very happy. Is there going to be some consolidation, right? Like, a stack of 20 tools may not make sense. But even in that case, right, people are using Crossbeam to think like, hey, where should we be focusing our efforts and our partnerships? But I think that really struck me because he was much happier with his current stack than with his monolithic solution that he was using previously.
Yeah, and user experience ends up playing a really big role too. I think we can, we actually had the stat recently. I don't know if Chris Castaldo, our CISO, is in the room, but I think we have, for every employee that we have of Crossbeam, there are 2 or 3 SaaS apps, right? Like the number of SaaS apps we use is a multiple of the number of employees we have. But the number that we actually log into and interact with is actually, scoped within an individual role, relatively small. And it's really all of this machinery in the background that is this enabling technology, whether it sits behind Slack or it's sitting behind Salesforce or, sitting behind the tools of record for every department. It becomes so much more powerful as an enabling layer and as a data layer. And again, that's where, I anticipate that 5 years from now, if not 1 year from now, the number of people whose jobs are directly impacted by Crossbeam is going to be a 10x multiplier on top of the number of people that log in to Crossbeam. And I think that's really just a trend that's not specific to us, but exciting in the market in general.
Yeah, absolutely.
True. I want to get back to a little bit of the inside baseball in the boardroom stuff, and want to put it through the lens of the people that are in this room. We've got a lot of people that lead partnership teams. We've got a lot of partner managers who are on partnership teams. If they are in a meeting in a few weeks with their CEO and they're telling the story about why in the next year we should double the size of the partnerships team or we should make these really amazing investments, when positioning that argument, what are some of the things that the CEO might be looking to hear? What are the things the CEO heard in their last board meeting that they're really trying to focus and optimize the company on? And how can we position the story of partner success being tethered to company success in the best possible way to have that resonate kind of at the most executive strategic levels of the company?
Yeah, I think I've said this before, but it does all come back to ROI and this next gen version of partnerships, right? Where it's absolutely not where non-revenue things go to die, right? Like, this is where revenue is generated and accelerated, and having the stats that track that is incredibly important. And also holding yourselves accountable to, and I'm not saying you should go to like a 50-50 quota system, but having you and your teams accountable to generating those results is pretty critical to saying, this is why my team should expand. Because at the end of the day, that's, it all comes back to that. And, I think we talked about a couple of ways that, I've seen partnerships really accelerate sales through palpably shorter, tangibly shorter sales cycles, higher conversion rates, just much higher pipeline. That, by the way, when it has higher conversion rates, is just more valuable than other marketing or sales-led pipeline. So that's, I think that's the first thing. But when I think back on what does a successful partnership program look like, what does a best-in-class one look like, and what is the sort of starting off point that you can, I think have a valid justification for wanting to expand your team. It's one, really having a concrete, and I think Crossbeam is being used to do this, but having a concrete sense of what it is you bring to your partners. There's sort of this great, there's like a press release, you shake hands, we have a partnership, but why does that partnership exist? I mentioned the UiPath example of a quintessential one where hey, UiPath, every dollar that they bring to themselves, they bring their partners quadruple, right? So having, what is your partnership relationship, and what is your version of that? And really understanding, hey, this is how, I'm going to mention Snowflake again, but hey, this is how I help Snowflake. Snowflake cares about compute and moving workloads to Snowflake. How are you helping Snowflake accomplish their goals? Because that is going to symbolize how much their AEs are going to work for you, right? And so when I see that sort of very rock solid justification in place, that to me is a sign of a lasting partnership. The second piece is really, and Bob, you actually mentioned this point, but something that got me really excited in the diligence process was for the best organizations, the best partnerships organizations, they had really infiltrated sales teams. AEs were on Crossbeam, and AEs were talking to the partnerships team nonstop. They had really discovered it in a way where I was hearing stories of AEs getting promoted 3 times in 1.5 years because they had discovered the value of partnerships data. And they had not just done this hey, every quarter, you got any leads for me, right? That kind of thing. Not going to work, right? You've got to have your data real-time integrated. You've got to have a system for consistently mining partnerships data. It's not going to do it for you. You've got to actually do that. But what is your system in place, right? Is this something that is, and this goes back to the predictability point, is this something that you're continually going back to build your pipeline, right? And how deeply integrated beyond just the partnerships team is that process? I think, and some of the tooling that and I swear this isn't an ad for Crossbeam, but I think one of the things that
we're here, it's all right.
Yeah, upsell your Crossbeam subscriptions. But I think some of that tooling really makes that important. Are you guys using it, right? That's what actually it gets back to the third and most important thing that I mentioned, which is measuring that ROI. And so those are some of the attributes of best-in-class partnerships teams. When those are all in place, I see the justification kind of sell itself, honestly, because imagine if you're putting, for even to put hard numbers, I was talking to someone who might be in the audience, but had mentioned that, his team was generating $4.5 million of high conversion pipeline from partnerships. What does that mean to a team? I mean, that's enormous, right? And to justify hiring more players to actually generate, to expand that pipeline is pretty much like a walk in the park, honestly, from a CEO or a board member perspective.
Amazing. What a perfect note to end on. Sarah Wang, I want to thank you so much for being here, coming to Philly, coming to Supernode. Sarah's going to be hanging out a bit today.